Today, we're going to do a deep dive into a case that is just heartbreaking and incredibly complex. It's the Robbie Middleton case. It's the story about, a young boy's strength in the face of just unimaginable suffering. It's also about a community just grappling with this really horrific act and the long and winding road to justice.
Yeah, it's really fascinating and troubling, this case, and how it sort of intersects with so many different sensitive issues like childhood trauma, the reliability of memory, the challenges of prosecuting a case years after the actual crime.
Exactly. And so let's sort of set the scene here. June 28th, 1998, in Splendora, Texas, we have Robbie Middleton. He's an 8-year-old boy, and he's celebrating his birthday. He just got a new tent. Imagine the excitement, right? Like later that day, he heads out to meet a friend, and he's planning to try out this tent, and this is where things take a very devastating turn.
And it's important to understand, like, the context, right? Splendora, this small town, the kind of place where, everybody knows everybody, and this crime, just sent shockwaves through the community. It wasn't just Robbie who was impacted. It was his family, his friends, the entire town.
Absolutely. So what exactly happened to Robbie?
Well, Robbie was found by neighbors, severely burned. We're talking 99% third-degree burns. He was tied to a tree, doused with gasoline, and set on fire. The brutality of this act is it's staggering.
It's difficult to even comprehend that level of violence, especially against a child. Did Robbie identify his attacker?
He did, right from the beginning, even through the pain and the shock. Robbie named his attacker, a teenager named Rex Taylor.
Okay, so the police have a suspect. What happens next? Did they arrest Rex?
Well, this is where the case gets complicated. So Rex and his friends, they were interviewed by the police. But they denied any involvement. And despite Robbie's testimony, there wasn't enough evidence at that point to actually press charges.
So you have this horrific crime, this young victim, and no clear answers. What were the initial reactions from the community?
I mean, there was a lot of fear and confusion, of course, but also, like, this sense of wanting to believe, that it couldn't have happened in their town, in their backyard. I think there's this human tendency to want to distance ourselves from uncomfortable truths, especially when they hit so close to home.
Right. But as time went on, did any other leads emerge in the case?
They did. Another teenager named Donald Wilburn Collins kind of came into the picture, and he was 13 at the time and already known in the community for being cruel to animals and just, bullying other kids.
Knowing what we know about Donald's history, how did he end up becoming a suspect in Robbie's case?
Well, there were a few things that raised red flags. First, Donald gave some very strange interviews to the local news. He knew details about the crime that hadn't even been made public yet, which was suspicious. It was almost like he was inserting himself into the narrative.
It's almost like he wanted attention, even if it was negative attention.
It's a really interesting observation. Criminologists often see this in cases like this.
So if Donald was sort of bragging, did he confess to actually hurting Robbie?
Not directly to the police, but he was arrested. And he admitted to participating in the attack.
Okay, so we have this confession. So case closed, right?
Well, unfortunately, it's not that simple. And this is where things take an even darker turn.
What do you mean?
While Donald was in juvenile detention, he started making threats to other teenagers there. He promised to burn them, just like Robbie. It was chilling. And one of the teenagers he threatened came forward with this shocking claim that Donald had confessed to him that he had burned Robbie to silence him.
Silence him about what?
Donald allegedly told the other detainee that he had sexually assaulted Robbie and that he burned him to prevent him from telling anyone. It's horrifying and adds another layer of complexity to this already tragic case.
So you have this confession from Donald, this incredibly disturbing motive, but the case was still dropped. Why?
Well, that's a question that has haunted this case for years. Despite all the red flags, the threats, the alleged confession, the authorities decided not to pursue charges against Donald at that time. It's hard to understand why.
It's baffling. So while all this is going on, what about Robbie? What was he going through?
It's hard to even imagine the physical and emotional pain he endured. He spent years undergoing these painful medical procedures, over 150 operations. The burns had long-term consequences for his health, his mobility, everything.
And yet through all of that, we hear stories about Robbie's resilience.
That's true. Despite everything, Robbie remained this bright light. He went back to school, he found ways to connect with other kids. He even became an advocate for other burn victims. He refused to let this define him.
It's a testament to the strength of the human spirit. But even with that strength, the fact that justice hadn't been served had to be a heavy burden to carry.
Absolutely. And that's where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
We left off with Robbie showing this incredible resilience while the system basically failed to bring his attacker to justice.
Yeah.
So what happened next?
Well, in 2010, over a decade after the attack, there was this glimmer of hope when a civil attorney, Craig Seco, took on Robbie's case.
A civil attorney. I thought this was a criminal case.
It was, but Seco had this really clever strategy. He knew that reopening the criminal case directly would be a tough battle, but he saw a chance to gain access to information by filing a civil lawsuit against Donald Collins.
So he was using a different part of the legal system to try and get the truth out there.
Exactly. A civil case has different rules of evidence and discovery than a criminal case. Seco knew that this could force authorities to look at the case again, even if it wasn't through the traditional channels.
It sounds like a long shot. Did it work?
Well, before we get into that, we have to talk about a tragic turn of events. Sadly, while all this legal maneuvering was happening, Robbie's health took a turn for the worse.
After everything he went through, something else happened.
Yeah. He was diagnosed with skin cancer, a direct result of the burns he suffered all those years ago.
It's just heartbreaking to think that after all he endured, this attack ultimately took his life.
Yeah. Robbie passed away in April 2011 at the age of 20. But even in his final days, knowing his time was limited, he showed incredible courage and determination.
So what did he do?
Well, he recorded this 27-minute video testimony. And in that video, Robbie gave this detailed account of the events of that day in the woods. And for the first time, he explicitly revealed the sexual assault that had actually happened before the attack. And he named Donald Collins as the perpetrator.
So this video became a crucial piece of evidence.
Absolutely. Up until this point, a lot of the evidence was circumstantial, right? It relied on Donald's suspicious behavior and the confession to that other kid. But Robbie's video testimony, that changed everything. It was no longer a child's recollection, clouded by trauma and medication. It was a dying man's declaration. It was recorded with the full weight of his impending death. It was incredibly difficult to dismiss or discredit.
Wow. So did authorities take action after this?
They did. Robbie's death and his video testimony became the catalyst for the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office to reopen the investigation. And keep in mind, this was over a decade after the initial attack.
I can't even imagine the challenges they faced trying to build a case after so much time had passed. Witnesses' memories might have faded, evidence could be lost, the legal landscape itself might have shifted.
Right. It was a monumental task. They had to find and interview over 200 witnesses, some of whom were now incarcerated. Tracking all these people down, getting reliable information from them after so long, it was just massive.
It must have been like trying to put a puzzle together when half the pieces were missing. Was there a moment when it felt like they hit a breakthrough?
There was. A key turning point was when investigators located Donald's cousin. And she said that her brother had actually confessed to her on the night of the attack, admitted that he'd tied Robbie to the tree, poured gasoline on him, and set him on fire.
So they finally had someone who could place Donald at the scene, backing up Robbie's account.
Exactly. This was a major victory for the prosecution, but there were still some legal hurdles.
What kind of hurdles?
Well, Donald was only 13 at the time of the crime. And Texas law regarding trying juveniles as adults, that had changed a lot since 1998.
So it became a question of which law applied.
Exactly. Donald's attorneys, they argued that he should be tried as a juvenile under the laws that were in place back when it happened. They said trying him under the current stricter laws would be unfair.
That makes sense. What did the prosecution say to that?
The prosecution countered by saying, yeah, the crime occurred in 1998, but Robbie's death, that was in 2011, and that was a direct result of the attack. So they said the newer laws applied.
That's fascinating. Legally, it's like they were arguing that the crime wasn't just the act itself, but also the lasting consequences.
Right, exactly. The judge sided with the prosecution, and Donald Collins was tried as an adult for murder.
After all these years, all these legal battles, Donald Collins finally faced trial. Can you tell me a little bit about the trial itself? Was it a straightforward retelling of events, or did the prosecution take a different approach?
Well, the prosecution, they opted for a non-chronological structure. They started by focusing on the medical evidence, showcasing the extent of Robbie's injuries, the long-term suffering he endured as a direct result of the attack.
That sounds really powerful, to center it around Robbie's suffering and the lasting impact of what happened.
It was. And remember, there were no living eyewitnesses to the actual attack. So Robbie's video testimony, that became the center of the prosecution's case. It allowed his voice to be heard, even in death, and to accuse his attacker directly.
It must have been an incredibly emotional moment in the courtroom.
It was. And the prosecution didn't stop there. They also presented evidence of Donald's other offenses, to paint a picture of his history of violence and cruelty towards other children. They wanted to establish this pattern of behavior to show Donald as a threat to society.
So after all the delays, all the twists and turns, what was the verdict? Did the jury believe Robbie in the prosecution's case?
They did. The jury found Donald Wilburn Collins guilty of murder. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison.
40 years. After 17 years of waiting, Robbie's family and community finally saw justice served. But I can't imagine that it erased the pain or brought Robbie back.
Right. It was a bittersweet victory, a long and arduous journey that ended in justice being served, but at such a devastating cost.
And what about Donald? Was there any sign of remorse? Any acknowledgement of the pain he caused?
Well, reports from the trial indicate that Donald just remained stone-faced and emotionless throughout the entire thing, even when the verdict was read.
That lack of emotion, that lack of accountability, it can be even more unsettling than like an outburst of anger. It makes you wonder about rehabilitation.
That's a great point. And it raises a lot of questions about how we handle juvenile offenders, the nature of remorse, and the possibilities for rehabilitation in the justice system.
We've followed the events leading up to Donald's conviction. But what about after? Did he accept the outcome, or did he try to overturn it?
Well, his attorneys, they filed appeals, challenging the verdict, the sentence. They argued that trying him as an adult was unfair, given how old he was when the crime happened.
So it sounds like they were still focusing on the legal parts of the case, not on Donald's responsibility for what he did.
Yeah. And that sort of highlights the tough balance between making sure someone gets a fair trial and holding people accountable, especially when it comes to juveniles.
So what was the outcome of the appeals? Were they successful?
No, they weren't. All of Donald's appeals were denied, upholding the original verdict and sentence.
So after 17 years, Robbie finally got justice. But this case goes beyond the courtroom, What are some of the bigger implications? What can we learn from Robbie's story and the fight to hold his attacker accountable?
Well, that's exactly what we're going to explore in the final part of our deep dive. We'll look at the lasting impact of this case, the lessons it holds for us as a society, the importance of protecting children, of making sure that justice is served no matter how long it takes.
So we spent this whole deep dive looking at the Robbie Middleton case,
Yeah.
right? From the horrible crime itself to the long road to justice. It's incredibly sad, but it's also inspiring in a way.
It really is. You have to face some hard truths about people and about the legal system.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we wrap up, what are the key takeaways for you? What do you hope people listening will think about?
Well, one thing that stands out to me is just how powerful a victim's voice can be. Robbie's video testimony when he knew he was dying, that was huge GE in bringing his attacker to justice. It reminds us that even when someone's gone, their words can still have so much power.
It's almost like he knew it was his last chance to make sure people heard his story, right? To get the truth out. And, I think it's important to remember how this case affected the whole community of Splendora, too. This wasn't just something on the news. It was a tragedy that touched everyone there.
Oh, absolutely. It broke their sense of safety, in a small town where everyone knows each other. It made them see that bad things can happen anywhere, even in places that seem perfect.
Yeah, and it raises questions about how we, as a society, protect kids. Robbie was failed in so many ways. By the adults who should have protected him, and by the system that didn't get him justice at first.
It really shows us how important it is to be careful, to see the signs of abuse, to make sure kids feel safe telling someone, and that people believe them when they do.
This case also shows how long trauma can last. We talk about Robbie being resilient, and he was, but he had those scars for years, physical and emotional.
That's true. And it's not just the victim, it's families, friends, the whole community. We need support systems, not just right after something bad happens, but for a long time afterwards.
This deep dive has been heavy, but what gives me hope is that justice was served in the end. It took 17 years, but Robbie's attacker was held accountable.
It shows how strong Robbie was and his family and everyone who fought for him. It also shows that even after a lot of time, the truth can come out. People can be held responsible no matter how long it takes.
I think that's a really important point. We can't let time or, how complicated things are stop us from seeking justice. We have to be watchful,
Yeah.
to speak up for people who need help, and to never give up on demanding accountability. Robbie's story is really tough, but it's also a story about strength and bravery and how truth always matters.
Yeah, he left a legacy, not just in what happened with the case, but in the work people are doing to help kids and the people who refuse to let his story fade away.
If anything from this deep dive has really stuck with you, I would say look for groups in your community that are working to stop child abuse and support victims. Your voice and what you do can make a difference. Thanks for joining us for this really important conversation.